All right. Well, hi, everybody.
Hey.
Hey, we're so glad you're able to join us today as we chat with Wendell Kimbrough. We're so excited, Wendell, for you to be here. And my name is Dave Frincke. I'm the movement leader for United Adoration. And with the awesome flower behind her face is Rachel Wilhelm, who's our
Hey,
United States team leader. And Rachel, you're currently in what city again?
Decula, Georgia. It's a suburb of Atlanta, and it's like Dracula without an R.
There
I'm
it
so
is.
glad you clarified that. I've been
Yeah,
wondering.
People
yeah.
would have been confused.
People say Dacula. It's Decula. So
Tequila.
Decula.
So I'm in Fort Wayne, and we always come up with different kinds of names for Fort Wayne, like the city that never sleeps, the Windy City, the land of opportunity. None of, well, but it's Fort Wayne, Indiana, Midwest. We have cornfields, so that's our
And Sweetwater.
And
Sweetwater. That's our
Sweetwater.
claim to
I
fame,
mean,
cornfields and Sweetwater.
you guys are on the map, man.
Yeah,
Totally.
Everybody knows Sweetwater, at least in our
Yep.
world.
love it, love it. It's a great place. And Wendell, where are you at?
So I'm in Fairhope, Alabama,
Nice.
which is a small town on the eastern shore of the Mobile Bay in
Nice.
Alabama. So if you went all the way down to the ocean and then backed up about 40 miles from the ocean, you would hit Fairhope.
Nice. And how long have you been there?
We came in 2014, so 6 years. In fact, it was my first Sunday at the church here was Palm Sunday,
Oh, cool.
2014. So I don't know what date that was, but by the liturgical calendar, we are 1 week away from our sixth year here at Church of the Apostles.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, we're really thankful that you're taking some time out of your day to hang out with us and chat. So if you're joining us, we're just gonna chat with Wendell and talking about his journey into songwriting, how the Lord has led him into the kind of content he writes about, and we just hoped to also just encourage local artists all over the country and the world, and that's one of the things we want to do in United Adoration. So Wendell, maybe a good place to start would just be, can you share with us more about your journey into songwriting? When did you start? How did you start? Were there any pivotal moments for you? Were there anyone specific that came alongside you and encouraged you? Just share with us a bit about how this happened for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's see. It's funny. I had like a kind of an innate musical sense as a kid, which probably a lot of artists would have stories like these. Like I think I wrote a song about my dog when I was like 5 or something. Like pretty young. Um, and I feel like I actually kind of always had like an interest in expressing myself through song. When I was like in middle school, I wanted to be a Christian rapper. That was my career aspiration.
Yes.
I was a very big DC Talk fan.
Yeah.
And so basically I wanted to be Toby Mac. Like that was who I was aiming at. But I would say college is really when I started writing more. I mean, I wrote some in high school. I was in a band that was like a cover band, like a Christian cover band. We did like Caedmon's Call and other greats of the late '90s CCM scene. All Star United, anybody? And I wrote some songs for that. That was probably like those were like the first songs that I actually like got up in front of a group of people and played and sang. But yeah, there were some really pivotal moments for me, not just as a songwriter, but like I would say as like somebody learning to use his own voice, which is really what songwriting is on a kind of on a metaphorical level. It's like, it's not just about your physical voice, but it's like the voice of who you are,
Totally.
and believing that you have something to say that's worth saying.
It's hard to come to that place, isn't it?
It's very hard. It's very hard. It's
Yeah.
it's taken me a long time, and it's still a struggle. You know, it's still like just I'm more inclined to, as a writer, to dismiss something I wrote as no good than I am to like put it out there and nobody else likes it. You know, I'm like way more self-critical and prone to kind of be like, no, that's not good. Don't let anybody hear that. And sometimes I'm really surprised when people respond deeply to stuff that I thought was not that good. And I think that is about this thing of like learning to, in some ways, to love and appreciate my own voice and what I have to offer, and recognize that I'm God's handiwork, and kind of who I am and what flows out of me is to some degree like his work, you know. There's more than just him, otherwise I'd be flawless, you know.
Well, I mean, I think we're working with songwriters and artists all the time who have those same struggles in a lot of severity, actually, just feeling, you know, I'm not worthy to release what God has given me, or, you know, I don't sound as good as that person, I don't write as good as that person, so what I do is not valid. And it's a common struggle.
Yep.
So
well,
how
I think go ahead.
Well, I'll just jump in and say I do have not done a lot of them, but I do songwriting workshops, and the whole thing is about addressing that, because the reality is the way you, I call it the voice of shame, because I really think that's what it is ultimately. But the only way you grow as a writer is by writing, sharing, and seeing how your community responds to it. And so if that voice of shame keeps you from actually sharing the stuff you write, you by definition never grow. Like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because everybody starts by writing really not great stuff. You know, I mean, maybe you have a moment of brilliance here and there. You know, I know people who like their first or second song was like really good, but then, you know, you get that really good song out of your system, and then like everything you write for the next month is lame, you know? And so that's just because we're human, you know, and it's a skill and it's a craft and you have to develop it. But when that voice of shame keeps you from sharing your voice never grows. And so you never become like who you could be as a writer, as a performer, as an author, you know. So yeah, when I do songwriting stuff, that's what I focus on, is like, how do we get you past the things that keep you stuck and keep you isolated, keep you from sharing what you've written.
That's good.
So you came from that place.
Yeah, and that's my journey. Yeah, so yeah, going back to my story, like you know, I have a memory. I was probably like 14 or 15, and everybody, actually almost everybody has a story like this. But you know, I was like 14 or 15, and it was at school, and it was like maybe between classes or lunch break or something, and somehow I like was singing, and this cute girl that actually had a great voice, was a really good singer, said something like, "You cannot sing," you know. And it just was like, oh, you know, just like spear through the heart, like, you know. And you know, it's like not to blame that girl or whatever. It's like the world tells us that we can't sing, and for the most part, unless you're like, well, maybe Rachel Wilhelm, you know, unless you just have one of those like really incredible voices that everybody's like, wow, that's, you know, you have an amazing voice. Like, you learn on some level, like, to be afraid of sounding bad, you know? So I would say that kind of like, that kind of narrative of like, hey, your voice is something to be potentially embarrassed about, you know, like don't be too bold, you know, don't be presumptuous is maybe one way that I would have thought about it. Like, don't presume that people want to hear you sing or what you have to have to say. And but the year after college, and this is kind of where I'm trying to get to in terms of kind of a pivotal moment for me, like the year after college, I lived in this Christian community on the eastern shore of Maryland, not Mobile Bay, but the Chesapeake Bay. And it was kind of like L'Abri, if you guys are familiar with L'Abri at all. It's like you're living in community with a bunch of other Christians, doing morning prayer every day, like learning together, a lot of things in kind of just a rhythm to life. And we were out in this beautiful place, and I started writing more songs that year. I had a little more time, and I found space to write some songs. And I wrote a song called "The Ballad of Frieda the Goose," which I think you'll know, Frieda.
I know it.
Rachel. Yeah. And
Brilliant song.
it's funny because I remember when I wrote it. It's a song where I like empathize with a goose.
We've all done that,
right?
Who has?
I set out to write this like humorous song, and by the end of the process, I actually had this kind of somewhat serious song about a goose. And when I finished writing the song, I remember thinking, I will never let anybody hear this. This is embarrassing.
Oh.
But I somehow, I mean, I had that community had grown very tight knit, and so I felt very safe with that group of friends. And I played the song for just one guy that was actually my roommate, and he was like, "This is a good song. You need to share this with some other people."
Oh.
I love that.
And that was like that community like totally embraced my songs. And by the end of that year, like I had written a bunch of songs and shared them with that community, and I felt very loved, very heard and seen, and very valued by that community. And they basically were saying, "You're a lot better at this than you think you are."
Yeah.
And you seem to really get a lot of joy out of doing it. And so maybe you should do more of this. You know? And at that time of my life, I was not pursuing a music career. I was not interested in, I had kind of talked myself out of that because it felt too scary, too vulnerable. So,
that community, it seems, I mean, not everyone has that, that sense of support and encouragement in community. That, could you press into that just a bit? Take a little detour from your story for a minute, because I think it's important we don't lose that element in your story of how important that community was. And
it's huge. Yeah. And, that hasn't been the only community that has served that purpose for me. But I totally agree. It is the number one most important thing to, maybe to life.
Yeah.
Like, I believe that a community that sees you, hears you, values you, loves you, is Jesus to us. Like, it is the incarnate Christ. It's what the body of Christ is supposed to be. And like, we could talk all day about how the institutional church fails at doing that in different ways.
Yeah.
But sometimes it does. Sometimes a small group in your church, or a group of songwriters who love Jesus that get together, can really create that safe space where you feel like you can express things that you would otherwise be afraid would be rejected, or might be rejected, And that is the heart of like growth and life and creativity, and that's where songwriting comes from. That's where it's not just songwriting. That's where like our gifts flourish, where we find the courage to like explore the things that God's given us to share.
I relate that to like the story in the Bible where the angel of the Lord calls out Gideon and says, "Oh, mighty man of valor." And he's like, "What? I haven't even done anything. What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
And it's like this calling out of your gift and encouraging you into it and pushing you forward into it. I've had that experience too. That's what it just makes me think of. It's a beautiful thing.
When you've, amen. When you've been in a community like that and you've experienced that, even if it was just for a retreat weekend or something, like, you'll remember it the rest of your life.
Yeah.
Because it's such a powerful experience.
Yeah.
It's interesting because we remember the hard moments, like when that girl said to you, "You can't sing very well," and we also remember those little moments that maybe people don't remember. A word of encouragement here, oh man, you can really do this. Like, it's amazing the power of words in how we say and how we encourage, or how we throw words around sometimes without much thought, that can really give a lot of wounding, especially for artists and musicians. Because I mean, we're all emotionally sensitive in different ways, and we take critique and criticism very harshly. We also really appreciate encouragement and praise very deeply, and that's just how musicians are wired, and creative people are wired in many ways. So it's we're always just surprised when we do our retreats about how much people appreciate the little nudges of encouragement, and how many people are carrying around so much pain from the past by people using words carelessly.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, when I'm at a retreat and I'm talking to songwriters, it's amazing to me how much hurt there has been. And my experience is very similar to theirs. And I can speak into that and say, hey, I've been there. I know what you're saying. I'm going to call you out. I'm going to ask you to play your songs for me because they're valuable. And I want to, and I think having that place to do it, I mean, at a songwriting retreat, wherever, but in a community, having that place to do it is so, so important for an artist. To be able to just sit down and release it and to be heard and seen. Yeah. So anyway, so moving forward with your story, you were on the Eastern Shore. What happened after college?
Yeah. So, really powerful experience in that community. It's funny, and I can be long-winded telling my story, so y'all help me keep moving along. But that same year, I worshiped at a black church. It was an AME church called St. Stephen's in Unionville, Maryland. Shout out if anybody knows Unionville.
I love this story, by the way.
That church, honestly, is the best church experience I've ever had. And it's one of the few times that I haven't been like the professional. I was just totally just a guy who showed up. I didn't have any official role at the church. So like my dad was a pastor, and, so I grew up always kind of on at church, and now as a worship leader, like I'm definitely on. I have a task to perform, and I'm very much performing in some degree when I'm at church. And that year at that church, I was just a dude, at this little church. There's probably 30 people. A lot of people in the church were related to each other. It was very much just like a family church in this small town in rural Maryland. And man, they loved me really well. I always felt just so embraced at that church. And the music was, but it was incredibly powerful. It was very low production value. Like, there was an out of tune piano and a guy who played the piano and a lady who led the singing. And the guy who played the piano and the lady who led the singing my impression was they did not communicate before the service at all. And even to the degree that there might have been a little bit of animosity between them. Yeah. Like just a little bit of like power struggle, like who's really in charge here, And so, but the way that songs happened on Sunday was like, the lady who was in charge of the singing would just start singing, just a cappella, and she had this big, huge voice. It filled the room. She would just start belting it out. And then the guy on the piano would just start running a chromatic scale up the up the keys until he found what key she was in. And this is as the song is just marching along.
That's amazing.
And then he would start playing, and usually just kind of by ear, like figuring out this, like the hymn, what are the chords. And by like verse 2 or 3, like it would really lock into place. And then it was this like rocking. I mean, he was like a honky tonk player, and it just but it was this incredible like tension and release, with every song where you're kind of like, is this gonna come together? And then it would, and you'd just be like, hallelujah, you'd just be like losing it. But similarly, that church, like they ministered to my heart, but they also like they would have like a men's choir. And somebody would just grab me and be like, "Come sing with us," And so I would be in the choir with all the men, and my little white boy voice, like just trying to keep up, But I literally like learned how to sing, trying to like hear myself, next to the really powerful volume of that congregation singing. Cool. Like if I'd had a vocal coach, they would have said I made like breakthroughs that year. Like I figured things out mechanically with my voice and with my diaphragm of like how to support my voice better so that I could do more just kind of intuitively. And it was the influence of that black church, like, inviting me, loving me, and calling me out,
Yeah.
I still think about that church a lot when I write songs because sometimes when I write songs for church, I mean, I'm trying to think who could sing this? Like, where would this be sung? And I think primarily I try to write for my congregation here in Alabama. But a lot of times I'm kind of in the back of my mind, I'm like, could they sing this at St. Stephen's? Would this work there? And I think a lot of my favorite songs that I've written would. They could totally do them there. They would cross that cultural barrier. Like We Will Say in That Day. That's a song that I wrote really with that congregation in mind. Like just the rhythm that they would have sung at, the syncopation, the way that the beat moves. Like, it's like I'm channeling the spirit of that church when I wrote that song, and it works great in other settings too, but it just, anyway, I'm kind of rambling. I've lost my story. I don't know where I am in my story.
I don't know.
I'm still on the Eastern Shore.
A lot of songs that fit that church, honestly, from your Come to Me album, from your Psalms We Sing Together album. I can totally hear that influence. So when I do hear those songs and listen to them on my own time, I'm imagining that church singing with you.
Cool.
Which is really cool because I know your story and we're good friends. And
yeah.
But it's super cool to hear you say it.
Sweet.
So what happened after your experience there?
Yeah, so I moved to Washington, D.C., took a job at Church of the Res, which is really where I met Rachel. I can't remember. Were you still at Res when I got there, Rachel? I feel like okay. Yeah, we just kind of crossed paths.
We did.
Initially, you were out in Northern Virginia, and but I worked for Res. I did their Sunday music. They were planting a church at the time, and so I got the task of like starting the DNA of a worshiping community, and its musical repertoire. And at the same time, I was trying to kind of make it as a singer-songwriter, not Christian, not worship, not sacred music, but just songs about life. My first record had the Ballad of Frida the Goose on it. Just folk songs. Yeah. And I worked really hard at that, as hard as I knew how to do, which I really didn't have a clue what I was doing. I experienced a lot of futility. Just, the kind of, who is it that pushes the rock up the hill? Sisyphus? Am I making that? No, it's not Sisyphus. I don't remember. Neither of you guys.
I should know.
Know your mythology, and neither do I. But man, I just felt like I was working so hard and very afraid and very like my insecurities were very triggered, and I had not known anybody I didn't have any mentors that were like coaching me in my music career. And so I had this church plant where I was learning how to lead worship and learning how to be the boss of that culture, and setting the culture is what I mean, like for the worship of that church. And then I had my singer-songwriter life where I was just trying to book shows and get people to come out and see me, but with like real deep insecurity about whether, I didn't want to annoy anybody. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like, I don't want to bother anybody, but please come to my show, like just deep inside, just like longing for the affirmation of people showing up. But, just, I had a lot of self-defeating kind of things. And a lot of it was like voice of shame kind of stuff. You're not good enough. Just self-esteem issues, They say when you've got self-esteem issues, you're always either one up. There we are. There are my hands. You're always either one up or you're one down.
Yeah.
And so you go from feeling like I'm the greatest thing in the world to like I'm worthless. But you really struggle to just stay on this like, hey, I'm me and you're you, and we're both humans and we both have gifts and we both have weaknesses. Like that's very hard. And that was extremely hard for me in my 20s. Like I knew I had a gift musically. And so there were times where I felt like I'm brilliant, like I'm the next Mozart, like if the world could just appreciate how incredibly brilliant I am, like that's what needs to happen, But then like the flip side of that was this, like, I'm afraid to ask anybody to come to my shows, because what if they say no? And what if they're too busy and I can't handle that? And if they don't like me, then I'm worthless, which is like, okay. So trying to keep the ball rolling, story. I really did not write sacred music at that point. I dabbled in it here and there. But as a worship leader, I did increasingly want songs that didn't exist. I came from hymnody. Like that was my bread and butter. I most of what we sang at Church of the Advent, where I was leading worship, were hymns, either retuned or the traditional tunes. And I was good at that. I kind of had a knack for like bringing hymns into the modern era with a guitar. Yeah. And I enjoyed doing that. And we sang some of the like contemporary Christian worship, kind of CCLI top 25 type of stuff as well. Yeah. But like we would preach a sermon series through like the kingdom parables in Matthew, or, we were like, our theology was kind of in this N.T. Wright, like rediscovering the kingdom of God. Yeah. And the centrality of that to Scripture. And there's not actually a lot of hymns that talk about the vision of the kingdom that we were preaching and that we were trying to build in our congregation. And there's not a lot of contemporary worship stuff that talks about that either. Right. And so I just found that I wanted more and different kinds of songs to lead my congregation in that didn't exist. And so I did start to kind of piece together, like write a few things here and there. It was kind of like starting all over again though, because I was like so insecure about whether, it was like, well, I can write a folk song and get up in a bar and play it, but man, singing something that I wrote at church, you're asking people to pray, essentially talk to God using the words that you offer them. And so it was like that shame voice was very strong again, and just
it's so
like,
weird how that like slices your artistry in half. you know, and you're like, I'm either in this pool or I'm in this pool. I don't know, you know.
Yep.
It's so strange.
And I totally did that. I totally defined myself. It was like, well, I lead worship, but my artistry is out here, you know, in the coffee shop, in the bar or whatever.
So how did your church respond when you started to bring your local artistry into the context of worship?
Really positively. Kind of to my like, you know, dismay a little bit, you know. You know, like one of the first things I wrote was "In You, Lord, Our Refuge Take," which is a Psalm 31 setting, and it made it on my most recent record, so it kind of sat in the archives for like 6 years.
Yeah.
But I wrote that. I don't remember why I wrote it or what. I think it was like for a particular service or something, and we sang it, and several people on my team were like, "This is great," you know, like, do this, like, do more of this, like, please write more of these. And it was that, to some degree, it was that kind of surprising experience of like, wow, this feels so vulnerable, so scary. But I'm sharing what I wrote, and then the community is like, hey, we love you. We love what you're doing. Keep doing it. You know?
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was like a start for me. The real pivot in my career in some ways was when I moved down here to Alabama. We came to this church because they were hiring an artist in residence. And without going into all the details, we were struggling to figure out how to make life work financially in DC.
It's hard there.
And, you know, with me, I was like, I had 2 part-time jobs, and the two together did not equal a full-time salary, you know, and the cost of living was super high. And so I thought, well, I will probably have to give up the artistic side of my life outside of church and like go to seminary, and because I was like, how else am I going to be a full-time employee somewhere? I don't know what I'm going to do full-time. So I'll work full-time for a church. I'll do like small groups or something, you know, I'll find some thing that I can do that'll be meaningful, but I'm going to give up my artistry in order to earn a paycheck.
Yep.
And then this little church in Alabama kind of reached out to me, or through a friend, like, who forwarded me the job thing, and it was like, we're hiring a full-time position for worship leader / artist in residence. We want to hire somebody who wants to write and create, and we want to make space for them to do that and encourage them to do that.
That's so beautiful. I love it.
It really was. It is beautiful, and particularly for me at that time, it was like exactly what I needed.
Praise God.
Literally. I mean, I literally would. You know, my wife and I, we look back at that and we're like, God moved. You know, we had reached this crossroads. We were not sure what was next, but we knew that change was coming, and we thought I was going to have to give up the songwriting part of my life to make a paycheck. And then all of a sudden this thing just landed in my lap. And actually, I remember crying a little bit when I saw the job description, even though I didn't know if we would even apply at that point. I mean, at that point, you know, cognitively, it was just like, it was just beautiful that existed. And,
I'm assuming
is what I was longing for.
I'm assuming you sent in your Goose song for your application, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, the world needs more of these. And
I've got a lot of songs about birds, so.
Well, I could write about peacocks. You can write about geese.
Yeah. And if you haven't written a peacock song yet, you should.
It's tricky writing a peacock song.
No, man, you just gotta get in you got to empathize with that peacock. Like, what does that peacock struggle with? You know,
I
I mean, as beautiful as a peacock is, like, do you think it walks around wondering if people think it's beautiful or not?
I'll tell you what the biggest struggle of our peacock is. He's not afraid of cars, and he will fly right in front of a car. And all of his friends, the chickens, are locked up. But
that sounds like a cautionary, like a Rocky Raccoon kind of song. the ballad of the once beautiful peacock now.
Solomon, the beautiful peacock.
Yeah.
Oh man.
King of birds.
King of birds.
I have totally changed the trajectory of it.
It's cool, man. Sometimes I need a little break from talk to my. I can just talk. I can just talk nonstop. So that's good.
Back to your bird album.
What's my bird album?
No, back to your bird album. So
back to my bird album. Yeah.
Album to.
No, he didn't. So basically, Wendell, something that I think is super important about your current church, Apostles, very beautiful congregation of people, was your commission by them to write a psalm every week, or at least tune a psalm.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's another thing where I really feel like God's hand kind of just lined up the dominoes and then was like, clink.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I had dabbled a little bit in psalm setting and had enjoyed it, but when I got here, my church said, well, first they said, you can write anything you want. You don't have to write church music. You can, you can do secular music if you want to. But, and this is kind of funny, but my boss, probably not fully realizing how big of a task it was, and particularly for me as kind of a perfectionist, like, he was like, hey, we like to sing something with the psalm. Could you just write something every week? You know, so we follow the lectionary, and there's a psalm appointed for every Sunday. And he's like, can you just write something every week for the psalm? And I was like,
wow.
Like, so the guy who it took me 5 years, 6 years as a worship leader to build up the courage to write one thing and share it publicly, with my congregation, like, is now supposed to write something for corporate worship every week, turn it around, get in front of the congregation and share it. I was just like, but some part of me was like, yes.
Even 119. I will do Psalm 119.
Yeah, even Psalm 119.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I was just like, I will do it. Like mind racing, but sometimes you hear a word of challenge and you're just like, that is what I need.
Yeah.
Every light in your brain just like lit up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was the greatest thing, man. It was like songwriting boot camp. Because I had a deadline, which is, I think, super important if you struggle to get out of your perfectionistic kind of loop. Like, I had deadlines. I had a community that was going to listen to what I put forward. And it's really a sweet community. Like, they were, we weren't going to like have a panel of like feedback after church where everybody was going to like critique it. But like, when one of the pieces that I wrote really resonated, people would just tell me, they'd come up and say, that one really spoke to me. That one really touched me. And the way we do the psalm, so I'm not writing a whole like metrical setting of the psalm every week. I'm essentially writing a little chorus, like 4 to 6 lines. And I'm trying to write what would be kind of the thesis of the psalm, or maybe the emotional thesis. I call it like the emotional core of the psalm. Like, what do I want the congregation to feel? Not even just what do I want, but like, why did David write this? Or why did, what would be the emotional response that David was trying to get? or that God wants us to feel, when we read this poem, when we sing this poem. And that's what I try to capture in the like chorus. And then we sing the chorus, and then we have a reader read a little bit of the psalm, and then we sing the chorus again, and the reader reads, and I play the guitar while the reader reads to kind of tie it all together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I think the technical term is it's responsorial.
Yeah.
And by the end of the psalm, we've sung that little refrain probably at least 4 times, maybe 6 times.
Mm-hmm.
And the great thing is, if you're trying to write stuff that's singable for a congregation, this was a great way for me to see what worked and what didn't.
Yeah.
Because if they don't have it by like the 3rd time,
mm-hmm.
it's something needs to change about it. It's probably it's too much going on, or it's too syncopated, or there's not enough repetition, or there's something about it that's keeping people from feeling confident that they can sing it.
Yeah.
So,
did you know that I do that at Redeemer? Yeah.
That's so cool.
Do you do it every week?
I do it during the penitential season. So I do it during Lent, and I do it during Advent. And
I love it.
Yeah, so I make them all, of course, really, sorrowful and
minor
keyed, like
yep,
medieval, maybe.
Every psalm's a lament.
Yeah. So, but it's a really great. You're exactly right. I've had the same journey, just on a smaller scale, and you've been an inspiration for that. I've seen you do it before, and I was like, that's a cool idea. I'm going to do it. But it's a good way to get the congregation involved and also have the reading anyway. But it's awesome.
So through that, you've encountered.
That's so cool.
You've encountered, I'm assuming, some difficult psalms to bring music to, melody to, but then also content oriented. Because one of the biggest struggles right now in the worship repertoire that goes across the whole world is that the content of those songs is extremely narrow, because it's designed for mass appeal. So you're not actually covering a lot of theological content or themes in the global worship space. But when you're embracing the psalm every week, you are hitting all sorts of different kinds of topics, all sorts of different kinds of emotions. So how have you learned to embrace that as a writer, and bringing that into corporate worship?
Yeah, it's great. And that is one of the reasons why I say it was like a songwriting boot camp.
Yeah.
Because like, I actually remember this. I have a friend from years back. Don't let me lose the thread and not come back to your question, but a friend who's a really gifted songwriter, and he was like in conversations with a major label, and they didn't end up signing him, but I think it was like the A&R guy who was like kind of coaching him some, and he's like, I've heard a lot about what makes you sad or angry in your songwriting. What gives you joy? Like, what are you happy about? And this is from like 20 years ago or something, but that kind of registered for me, because it's like, I think most of us have we have certain modes of expression that feel very comfortable to us.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have modes of expression that feel, they actually just feel very vulnerable, is usually what it is.
Yeah.
Like for me, joy is actually the most vulnerable emotion in some ways. But the Psalms, if you're marching your way through the Psalms, like, you got to deal with all of it.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the reasons that the Psalms are such an important discipleship tool, is they help us become emotionally whole people. Like, they help us work those muscles, those emotional muscles that we have let atrophy, or that our family of origin didn't value, or whatever the case may be. Our culture, we have whole cultural expressions, things that are good and things that are bad. I'd just say that the process of sitting down with some of these Psalms and wrestling with them and asking, how do we sing this? You know, how can I get up in front of my congregation on Sunday and offer them something that is faithful to this psalm and that is going to make sense to them and connect with them? Because I believe kind of notionally that this psalm is here for a reason. You know, it's not just wasted space in the Bible.
That's right.
But using the playbook of worship that I've been given, which is hymnody and contemporary American worship, there's no mode of expression that fits this psalm. Yeah. So what do I do? You know?
Yeah.
And it's stretched me. I mean, like I didn't grow up listening to the blues. I mean, I grew up in Mississippi, so like the blues were around, you know, and I think that probably influenced me a little bit, but it wasn't like, you know, I don't have any blues records at home, but like when I came to Psalm 69 for Good Friday, Draw Near is a blues tune, really.
Heck yeah.
And that was the only way to do that for me. You know, that was like the only way that I could express that. And I think part of what was cool about that was like, just recognizing that there are plenty of modes of expression in the musical language that God's given to humanity to do everything that the Psalms challenge us to do. We just are afraid of some of them in church, or we're not comfortable with them, or they're out of the ordinary for us. And part of what's been powerful for me has just been learning to get out of my kind of what musically feels most comfortable for me in order to try to get some of these other emotions to get expressed. I don't know if that's making sense. I feel like I'm a little abstract there, but
no, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, it's the conversation of content over style. It's like, you know, right now we have a lot of style that's driving content as opposed to the content driving style. Yeah. And I think that's a really important discussion to have, because I think generally speaking, you know, that we've drifted so much to style first, and then what kind of content fits in that style. But when we do that, we lose a lot of the treasures of Scripture that need to be sung, that need to be in our churches. And I think that's a struggle right now for the people in general. So I think this is a really important piece to dive into in the future too.
I love that. And I hadn't thought of it exactly like that, but that's totally right. It's like, here's this text that needs to be sung, but it doesn't feel like the musical stuff that I'm most comfortable doing. So how do we do it? And there's a rich palette of colors and paints in American music, actually, to draw from. You know, it's super rich. I mean, I think America's got the coolest music in the world, and it's probably just because I'm American. But you know, jazz and blues and rock music and bluegrass, and I mean, there's
country, and
it's all there. You know, I mean, rap.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, the rap songs, and there's a variety of rap songs that speak to me, but most of the ones that I initially found a lot of resonance with were ones that expressed anger.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't have any other music that helps me do that. You know, I wasn't into like metal. Yeah. But we need that. We need music that helps us express anger. And it doesn't have to be metal or rap, but like we're not healthy humans if we don't know how to express our anger in appropriate ways, you know? And God gave us a whole bunch of angry psalms. So I think that singing about our anger to God is actually one of the things that he wants us to do with our anger that's appropriate and responsible and godly even, you know? So,
I think people are afraid of that though, Wendell. What, I mean, I'm not asking you to speak for everybody, but why do you think there is that fear of going there? Of going into the angry places, into the sad places, into actually stepping over that threshold into lament.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I don't think people even understand what lament is, but a lot of the Psalms are lament Psalms or have portions of lament in them. Why do you think people fear that? Or maybe what was your hang up with that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's easy to speak to because I still have the hang up.
Yeah, good. Okay.
You know, less so with sadness, but more with anger. It feels like jumping off of a cliff and not knowing where you're going to land, or it feels like accelerating in a vehicle that you're not sure if the brakes work.
Wow.
It's like, if I go there, I don't know where this ends. Like, if I let myself be angry, do I eventually become like abusive or raging or like, and really what that is, and I think what that is for me is, just not having healthy models of mature expression. So if you think about how, I mean, we could talk about family of origin, because I think that's where it's most powerfully shaped. And like, I can just say in my family, we didn't do anger.
Yeah.
If you were angry, you pretended you weren't angry. That was basically it. Anger and shame were tied together.
Yeah.
It was shameful to be angry. So if you were angry, you kept it, you figured out some way to stuff it. That was my family. And that's a lot of families actually. Particularly Christian church, good, families. Like, anger is bad, full stop. But also just culturally, like, you think about how anger is portrayed in film. You see like the big dramatic, like, blow up, the spousal abuse, the like, the like, whatever, the violent movies,
my gun,
yeah,
all kinds of violent things. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the implicit message is like anger is uncontrollable, and that's just that. I think when we haven't seen healthy models of anger, I'm just like, I can't think of, and maybe we could if we put our minds to it, but I can't think of a place where I've seen portrayed in film, someone saying, like, somebody who's been very hurt and is very angry about it, coming to someone and saying calmly but firmly, like, that hurt. That made me very angry. Here's why. I need you to know. Like, just this, it's like mature, it's calm, it's reflected, it's not just this unbottling of rage. It's like, it's an honest representation of that anger, but it's not this uncontrollable rage thing. That's, I think the way Jesus expresses anger, actually, when he cleanses the temple, is a good example. It's clear he's angry. I mean, I don't think you can really read that passage honestly and not see Jesus is pissed.
Yeah.
But we get angry about one thing over here, and we apply that anger over here. Like, something goes wrong at work and we come home and like steam valve at our spouse or something like that, Jesus's anger leads him to act, and he acts on the thing that is the source of the anger, the injustice going on in the temple,
Sure.
the poor being kept out of worship. The Gentiles are being kept out of worship, actually, depending on which gospel you read. So there's racism and there's oppression of the poor, and Jesus acts in such a way that very demonstrably like shows his anger at that injustice, and also like helps to correct the injustice. That's like, there's mature expression of anger. Yeah. Like, he didn't just go on social media and vent, you know. He didn't like set fire to the temple, you know, and hurt a bunch of people. There's no collateral damage, you know. It's like, it's very focused, very clear. Anyway, well, I'm rambling, but
well, I think
anger is super important.
I think there's this thing in people where they feel like they can't be honest with God. They would never say that. They would never say, I don't feel like I can be honest with God. Yeah. They don't believe that they can actually express anger, fear, sorrow, depression, especially anger, to God himself. And they feel like if they do that, maybe God will strike them down. Something will happen. They'll pay for it somehow. That, you know, it's a bad thing to express your honest, true feelings to God. Because I think sometimes when we're praying, even as just people of God, we tend to kind of like try to say the right words and not like just speak plainly to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's always been kind of because I'm a lament person. So like, I've always lamented my whole dang life. Like to me, it's like where I live. And so there is a point, I think, where people have this, when they're faced with the option to lament, they don't even know what to do. They don't even understand what to do. And I'm like, well, it's just praying to God and being honest and saying and expressing that those emotions freely to God. Like, what is he going to do to you? God loves you, you know? And so I think there's this disconnect, this huge disconnect with what people believe can be said to God himself in their own prayer lives, even. And then we even have scripture, of course, like what you're saying, we have scripture that tells us that we can do that. David did that. I mean, it's all over the Bible. Oh, not the prophets. Anyway, we could I could go on forever about this. But, you know, and the whole thing makes me, you know, lament about that. But but it's super hard because I think there's this huge challenge for our songwriters, for our modern songwriters, and for our churches and for our pastors and our worship directors to bring this kind of stuff in. How do we do it? How do we bring it in and convince people that it's healthy? You know, how do we create a new culture of vulnerability and honesty with the scriptures and with the Lord, and bring it into church and church music?
I think this is the beautiful role of the artist and the songwriter, which I think hopefully everybody who's listening or watching and who are serving in their local churches are really encouraged by this conversation. Is the idea of, you know, there's an incredible call and role and assignment on songwriters and artists in the local church, and that's to give expression to so many of these things, and expression that's in a redemptive way, and in a way that invites a community of people who love Jesus to engage in, a community of people that we love, who loves us, who we support, and who supports us. I mean, I think there's so much in this conversation that hopefully is really encouraging to people serving on the local level, and that's really where our heart is too, is to really help encourage and equip local songwriters, local musicians, local artists to continue to serve their local churches in their home cities. And so I guess, you know, maybe we should do a part 2 sometime.
I can talk
time and continue our Bird album. But if you were going to just summarize in just a couple closing thoughts, if you're going to summarize some encouragement, Wendell, for local artists right now, what would you say? How would you encourage local artists right now?
Yeah, I think going really with what we've been talking about. I have been surprised by how receptive people are to lament, to expressions in church that I might not expect them to be comfortable with. And I think that in a lot of ways, my writing comes out of my own work. Like I've done therapy. I'm doing work to like deal with my own emotional brokenness, my own stuff. And when I am doing that work, and then I try to bring the honesty that comes out of that work into my writing, I find that it's helping other people who are on similar journeys, or maybe aren't. Maybe you're not on the same journey I'm on, but I have been surprised by how when I take that step where I'm like, I don't know if I play this song on Sunday, if we sing this psalm of lament, I don't know how people are going to respond to it. I'm afraid they're going to reject me or, just dismiss me essentially. And I've been surprised by how people, I think, are actually really hungry for a more honest expression of their real lives on Sunday at church. And so if you're an artist, you're a writer for the church, like, just take some risks, and it's not that they're all going to succeed, That's part of what a community is good for, is like, it does help you also recognize sometimes you're just like, yeah, that just didn't really work very well. You can kind of see that, even without anybody saying anything to you, you can just kind of tell like, yeah, that one didn't really quite land.
Oh, wow. Let's try again.
Oh, well, let's keep going. At least I didn't spend 16 hours working on that, like, yeah. I shared it. It wasn't awesome. So I'm going to scrap that one and move on. Yeah, I just think there's a real hunger for a more honest expression that's really psalmic. That's how I would describe it. It's like an expression of worship that's more like what we see in the book of Psalms. And sometimes people don't know that they're hungry for it. It hasn't reached up here yet. But I think when, as an artist or a writer, you can write something that's honest about your own, it's basically authentic to your life and also authentic to the scriptures, God can do something really powerful with that.
Yeah.
And so I just encourage people to branch out, like try setting some of those Psalms of Lament. Try dealing with some of the minor prophets and the stuff they're crying out about, because it's relevant. It's very relevant to our lives and our world right now.
Great.
Yeah. Wendell, thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day. And I know
thank y'all.
It's nice to at least see each other's face during this time of quarantine and sequester, but it's also great to remind ourselves that we're all in this together, that we're all in community, and so very thankful for this conversation. Thank you for everyone who was able to join and listen, and we'll see in the future if we can get Wendell back for a part 2. So
I love what you guys are doing, man. This is really cool. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be part of it.
All right. See you guys soon.